For watch enthusiasts, there are a lot of watches out there with cult followings. But I can only think of one that was spawned by a future governor, chasing an invisible alien killing machine through a South American jungle. And that watch is the Seiko Arnie, named after the man, the myth, the former governor himself, Arnold Schwarzenegger, as he wore it in multiple films. Although I think most of us remember it as the watch he wore in Predator, along with another future governor who didn't have time to bleed. Now, the original Arnie, the Seiko H558, is long gone. But like all good movies, they decided to do a remake, and in 2019 they released a trio of new Arnies. And this one in particular is the SNJ025. More recently, they actually came out with a few higher-end versions as well, and those I think actually have a dive logger. But today, we're checking out the base version, and this is the one that's probably most faithful to the original. For this one, Seiko went with a 46.7mm wide case, as well as an equally longer lug-to-lug of 50.5 and a total thickness just under 15mm. Lug width is 22, and it does have a hardlux crystal on top. This is Seiko after all. And then over at the right, you have a screwed down crown, and at the left, you have screwed down pushers. So this one is built like an action star, and in short, it's not for the timid. It's a larger watch that is basically an anti-digi version of their tuna. So it's built tough like a diver, but with all those extra quartz-powered features and functionality. And one nice thing about all the remakes is that they made them solar, and that only adds to the utility. Back in the day, the Arnie was probably the biggest, baddest, stealthed out tactical watch around. So it's no wonder that Schwarzenegger became a fan. I mean, he is famous for driving a Hummer. These days, however, there are a lot more competition for a watch like this, and particularly from G-Shock. But I think the Arnie still has a place in watch fans' hearts. After all, it's got that Hollywood nostalgia. And even though I'm not a fan of larger watches, or even anti-digi watches, I wanted to buy it just to try it out. I've just always been curious and thought it was a good watch to have to cover on the channel. And once I did, I gotta say I was actually a little surprised when I got it on the wrist. As far as larger watches go, this one is fairly comfortable. Far more comfortable than that Orient M-Force I recently covered. Maybe that's because of the case shape, or maybe it's because it has a really nice rubber strap on it, or because it's not too heavy. I think it's around 115 grams. So with my 7¼ inch wrist, it still felt larger, and there was definitely still some overhang. But it wasn't top heavy, and it never really felt overbearing. The case design itself is very Seiko tuna-ish, if you're familiar with that one, where it's very round and most of it is dominated by this black coated shroud, which is actually attached by bolts on either side of it, and technically it is removable. I've even seen some people swap it out for some aftermarket shrouds. Then sitting underneath that shroud sits an actual steel case, which you can see from the lugs protruding out at the top and the bottom, as well as if you flip the watch over, you can get a glimpse of it with the case back. On the right, you have a screwed down crown, and over at the left, you have the pushers for all those extra features, which are also screwed down to lock them from being used underwater. Or maybe it's more proper to say that they're unscrewed, because that's when they're fully extended out, and that's what prevents the pushers from being used. And one minor issue I found is that when it's on your wrist, it's pretty hard to unscrew or rescrew those pushers. Maybe it's just because I'm right-handed and it just really felt awkward kind of reaching around to get to them. Now, in some ways the case is a bit asymmetrical, with the two pushers on the left and the center crown on the right. Although one nice touch is that Seiko positioned the steel bolts for the shroud in a way to help balance all of that out. It's also worth pointing out that the crown here at the right is not your typical analog style crown, as when you pull it out, it doesn't automatically let you adjust the hands or freely rotate. The analog hands are actually directly linked to the internal digital clock. So when you pull the crown out, it just opens up the settings part of the digital interface, and then you use the pushers at the left to adjust the time on the little LCD screen. Once you push the crown back in, the hands automatically adjust to where they should be. And if you didn't catch this earlier, this thing does have a hardlux crystal. Now, it would be cool to see a more scratch-resistant sapphire crystal here, but this is Seiko, and for whatever reason they just don't seem open to that. at least not at this price. And let's not forget the bezel here, which sits just above that crystal. It's a little bit harder to get a grip on it just because of that shroud, but there are cutouts on the upper and lower edges of it just for that. And once you do get a decent grip, I gotta say it has a fantastic bezel. It's 120 click, unidirectional, with a fantastic audible and tactile feel as you rotate it. Seriously, this may be the best Seiko bezel I've seen so far. The dial itself is a flat black with white indices and accents. On some solar watches, it's pretty obvious where the solar cells are. But here, Seiko does a pretty good job of hiding them. I'm not sure if they're under the dial or the LCD, but they gotta be somewhere. As for the design, it's a standard Seiko style dive watch design. Just squished a little bit at the top to fit that digital display. So you have your standard dots, dashes, and triangle creating a nice crosshair effect, as well as a raised chapter ring sitting on the outer edge with minute indicators. Plus the standard Seiko diver handset. Except here, it is shrunk a bit. And from a design perspective, this is probably my biggest issue with the Arnie. The hands are just too small. I know they did it this way so that they never cover up that digital display, but it makes the entire thing seem tiny and a little harder to read. Now, in theory, this thing is designed to be a functional powerhouse that combines the best of everything. It's a fantastic looking watch that gives you the capabilities of a Seiko diver with the functionality of a digital watch, and all powered by a solar movement. Meaning this thing should be able to go anywhere and do just about anything, and work flawlessly for 15 to 20 years before you have to do anything to it. But in practice, it's a little bit more complicated. The LCD screen is clear, but it's so small it's not always the easiest to read. And the same goes for the smaller hands on the analog part. And for me, this is kind of my whole issue when it comes to Ani-Digi watches. I mean, they're supposed to give you the best of both worlds, but more often it comes across like being a compromise between the two. Moving on to the Lume, and this is a Seiko, so you kind of know what to expect here. In fact, with my longevity test, it kept up with a Seiko Turtle, so it's Seiko good. In worst case scenario, if it's the middle of the night and you're hunting down a predator in the jungle, you always have a backlight on that LCD screen. Movement-wise, this is using Seiko's Caliber H851, if that actually means anything to you. If not, the short version is that it's a solar quartz Ani-Digi movement, one that has an alarm, chronograph, and a perpetual calendar added to it. The analog hands are also completely synced to the digital clock, so when you're setting it, it pauses and then resumes back to where it's supposed to be. With regard to value, the MSRP here is $525, but if you look around, it shouldn't take you long to find one that's closer to $350, which overall isn't bad for what you're getting. If you're looking for comparables, just check out all the metal case G-Shocks out there. Back in the day, Stallone was Arnie's biggest competition, but these days, I think it's the G-Shock. When it comes down to it, the Arnie is a watch I can appreciate for what it is. And I think at this point, I understand why some people love it, why it has such a following, even beyond that initial Schwarzenegger aspect of it. The Arnie is a highly capable, great-looking watch. In fact, I think it looks better than almost any G-Shock out there. And that's probably who this watch is ideally suited for. Someone who wants all the capabilities of an Ani-Digi G-Shock, but doesn't want all the plastic G-Shockness that comes along with it. Or maybe just someone that prefers classic Seiko design language to the more modern Casio. And if that sounds like you and you got a bigger wrist, then it's definitely worth checking out. But as for me, I think the Arnie is more of a pass. It's still a little bigger than I like, and I still don't really get the whole point of the Ani-Digi thing. And especially in today's age of mobile phones, at this point, I'm just more convinced that it's better to go either or and not both. And to be fair, I knew that going in, but I still wanted to give the Arnie a chance before I sent it off to the chopper. And ultimately, I'm glad I did. But what do you think about the Arnie? Not just this one, but all the Arnies that are out there, and especially the newer, higher tech ones. They look cool, but I'm not sure who's going to buy that over a dive computer. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.